Okay, everybody. It is 5 o'clock Central Time, so we will get started with one of two webinars today. This one's going to be about creating a Windows virtual machine in Azure, which is a question that I get asked fairly often because I use Azure right now primarily to install software as prerequisites for our workshop. So when people want a instructional video on installing some kind of Python library or Python itself, I use Azure VMs oftentimes to do that. Because usually I use macOS to do programming work. And a lot of you out there are using Windows machines, so you'd like to see it on a Windows machine so you can relate to it. A couple things before we get started. We have a new subreddit. Check us out on SME Virtual. A lot of interesting posts already in there, mostly by me. Feel free to add your own as long as it's engineering and manufacturing related. Could be questions, could be something interesting, could be feedback. I invite you to check that out. Of course, we also have our Discord chat, which is here. You can see the public room being displayed here. And if you have any questions about what you're seeing on any videos, go ahead and pop on there and ask me. Adam J. Cook on there. You should be pretty easy to find me, and you can either direct message me or put a question in the room itself and for everybody to see. Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be looking at something called Microsoft Azure. If you're not familiar with it, this is Microsoft's cloud platform, one of the three most popular platforms, the other two being Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud Platform. Probably for a lot of the stuff we'll be doing in the SME Virtual Network, Azure and Google Cloud Platform will be our go-tos, but there will be some stuff where we use AWS. There are some distinct advantages and disadvantages with each of them. The advantage of Azure is because Microsoft owns it, it has some very good, what I'd call first-class support for Windows. And if you're running Windows workloads, or in our case, you're trying to start a Windows VM, it's probably one of the first choices I'd look at to do so. So if you don't have an Azure account, you can sign up for one for free. And I think that Microsoft gives you, excuse me, some credits. And indeed they do. They give 12 months of free services. And I gotta be careful with this because I think there's also, it's 12 months of some popular free services, which you have to check out. And then they give you like a $200 credit. So you can explore any Azure service. So some services in the cloud cost more than others. And so, you got to be careful about that if you're creating something, particularly for production. When we do stuff in the SME Virtual Network, we will talk about the costs associated with whatever cloud resources that we're using at the time on our videos. So it won't be totally unknown what's going on. And then, if you're a longtime customer of Azure, you get some what they call always free services, and you should check those out. There's some pretty generous allocations they give you for free forever. And so if you wanted to take advantage of those, we won't be diving into those today. But anyway, that is Microsoft Azure. You can sign up for free. When you do sign up and you log in for the first time, you'll be presented with something that looks like this. Say I have a dashboard. Okay. Today we will be looking at Virtual Machines Classic. Okay. A virtual machine is just the way it sounds. It is not a physical machine like a tower sitting on your desktop or a laptop. It is a machine that consists of cloud resources. So it's kind of in the cloud, and it has some virtual processors associated with it. And the key point, if you're new to this that's sort of an imperfect definition, but if you're new to this whole thing, the key point is that you really don't care how the virtual machine is being created at a low level. You just care that one is being spun up at your command, created, and that you can use it to do something useful. Okay, so you really don't have to concern yourself with, installing operating systems or figuring out networking or stuff. I mean, there is some of that still, but a lot of the low-level machinery is done for you, which is really helpful. Okay, and so today what we want to do is we want to create a virtual machine. Now you can already see I have one running. We'll be using that later on today. I have Anaconda Python already installed on it because that process takes a little time. But we want to create one from scratch. So I've clicked on Virtual Machines Classic over here, and then I want to hit Add. Okay, and oops. What should happen is, okay, so there's like a wizard that pops up. You can see that it has many tabs. Okay, and we're just going to walk through this. Okay, a little bit. Pay-as-you-go subscription. So this is my personal cloud account where I do some personal stuff. You can rest assured whatever VM I create, I'll delete right after this webcast. So don't think about hacking it or anything because it won't be there. So subscription pay as you go. I believe there's another subscription if you have like a corporate subscription with them. There's ways with Microsoft. There's like an MSDN subscription. But for most of you, it's going to be pay as you go, and that's going to be the only option you have. For resource group, this is sort of a grouping of various resources. And if you need help understanding what this stuff means, Microsoft puts like a little eye here that you can hover over. You can read it here. It's just a collection of cloud resources that sort of share the same life cycle. When we get into more advanced stuff, we'll see what that is. But if you don't have a resource group already, and I already do, I have this resource -RG resource group, you can create a new one. Okay, a virtual name, you can really call it whatever you want. I think there's some restrictions in terms of, yeah, they show them here off to the side what you can call it. I'm just going to call mine SMEV3, really doesn't matter. Region, Central US, that's appropriate because I'm in Texas. Okay, image, okay, which is essentially the operating system that you want. Okay, so I want a Windows 10 operating system. Okay, so what I'll do is I click, if you didn't see that, I click Browse All Images and Disks. And so this is going to look into some kind of library that Microsoft has available for you. And you just type up here in the search box, just want Windows 10. There's lots of choices, okay? Sometimes you want, Visual Studio installed along with your Windows 10. And so I'll usually pick, Visual Studio Community 2017 with Windows 10. Usually you're going to select 64-bit, which is x64, unless you have a really good reason not to. I would recommend that because of memory limits with x86, which is 32-bit. But for this example, I'm going to keep it simple, and we're just going to install sort of a vanilla-looking Windows 10 Professional VM. So I'm going to click on that. Okay, and it's going to let, it's going to put that in the box. Now we want to determine the size of the machine. So this is basically the virtual size of the machine, the number, the amount of memory, the amount of networking capability, and the amount of virtual CPUs. And so we'll click on the change size link here, and then again, sort of a list pops up. They're going to give you an estimated cost over here per month of what, if you keep your VM running, throughout the month, 24/7, then you're going to pay roughly this amount over here. You can see it gets rather large as you go up in machine size. Okay. The one I usually select is, it really doesn't matter for this. We'll just select this A6 here. I'm not going to keep it running, but if I did keep it running 24/7, it would cost $372 a month. So if you will be doing some of this work, make sure to keep an eye on costs. At the end of this, we'll be shutting down this VM that we create so that we're not incurring these costs, because I really don't need the VM. I'm just doing it for this webinar. So go ahead and select that, and it's going to go ahead and pop it in there. So that's 4 virtual CPUs and 28 gigs of memory. That's a pretty bulky machine. Okay. Then you're going to want an administrative account. Okay. So I'm going to do, my username here. Let's type in something meaningful that you won't be able to see. And okay. Okay, so it does require you to have a password of some kind of complexity, and it'll yell at you if you do not. Okay, public inbound ports. So by default, the virtual machine we're creating is pretty locked down, considering that you can access it publicly through the internet, and they don't want a ton of ports open so that people can poke at your machine. So the issue with us, of course, is that I usually want to access the virtual machine through something called RDP, which is Remote Desktop Protocol. It is a protocol that in simplest terms, sort of calls into the remote machine that we're creating and projects the remote machine onto your desktop through a special program called an RDP client, which is, I'll show you how to get that if you're on a Mac in a minute. If you're on Windows, you already have it. I believe Windows 7 has it, and I know for a fact Windows 10 has it installed by default. So we're going to want to check the RDP. If you didn't want to actually visually look at the desktop you're creating, then you wouldn't select this, and then you wouldn't have access to it. Okay, so RDP, it's giving you kind of a warning here saying these are exposed to the internet. Normally, if you're creating a virtual machine to run production workloads, you would have very little inbound ports open so that people, again, couldn't hack your machine. Okay, save money. If you happen to have this license, you can fill this information out. We're not going to do that because we're not. And let's go on to the next part of the wizard, which is the disks. Okay, so you have some disk types. SSD stands for solid state drive, which is a faster drive than a standard hard drive. Okay, it is nudging you to pick the standard as solid state drive by default. That is a good default. If you needed some enhanced performance on the drive side, which we probably won't need a lot within the SME virtual network, but if you did need it, you could select premium. Unfortunately, you need to select a certain virtual machine size. Remember, we selected A6 on the previous part of the wizard to use that. So standard SSD will be fine for us right now. We don't need any additional disks. So let's move on to networking. Okay. Basically, it's going to try to fill in most of this stuff for you, I believe. There's some, it creates a public IP for you. It creates a virtual network for you. This is sort of an isolated network infrastructure that's going to serve your virtual machine that you're creating. For the most part, we'll be keeping the defaults, but for some more advanced stuff, we may screw around with this. For now, the defaults are fine. So we'll just go ahead and accept them and go on to management. This is also fine. If you needed some advanced stuff, you would be changing things in there. And this is fine as well. and this is fine as well. And now we will create it. So it's basically on this screen, it's telling you what it's going to do. And so from what you've selected and what you've specified, it will basically create a deployment script behind the scenes and launch the virtual machine on the Azure infrastructure. Okay, you can see here it's going to be about 50 cents an hour. So that's fairly expensive if you're just using it for test purposes like I am. But again, whatever workload that you're using the virtual machines for, you have to keep an eye on costs. And then we'll go ahead and create it. Okay, it's going to do some animations here, submitting the deployment in progress. Okay, and here we go. If everything works out correctly, it should start to populate. Now this takes about 5-6 minutes, I think, if I remember correctly. Right now what it's doing is it's creating your public IP, some network resources here. And it's sort of going to work. Now, when you have the green check boxes here, or the checks, it means it's done. It's not only created it, but it's actually provisioned it. So it's created for real. When it has this sort of spinning refresh arrow, it means it's in progress. The deployment script is running against the Microsoft Azure infrastructure, and it's actually creating the virtual machine. So you can see the provisioning state is running right now. I believe when it gets done, it'll say something like succeeded here. And when it says succeeded, you can then hopefully log in to your virtual machine through the RDP client. Okay. So while this is provisioning, let's talk about the RDP client, okay? So on Windows 10, you should have something called RDP, or Remote Desktop. Okay, so if you go into your Start menu and you type in Remote Desktop, there should be a little icon that comes up. When it spins up, I'll show you where it's at on the virtual machine. But I'm on a Mac right now, so I can't show you on Windows. But with that RDP client, you can essentially call into the virtual machine that we're creating right now, and then it will visually produce the desktop of the virtual machine on your screen. Okay. For Mac, in the Mac App Store, there's something called Microsoft Remote Desktop 10, and this is essentially Mac's version of the Remote Desktop client. And so here too, you can use your Mac to call into the virtual machine that we're creating right now, and you can get the screen back. Okay, you can see some examples down here. You have the Mac interface on the outside, but the RDP client is projecting the virtual machine desktop in a window on your computer, and you can interact with it. Okay, and that's the goal here. So it looks like it's still sort of working. And so I am going to mute right now until it gets done. And when it gets done, we'll proceed with connecting to this virtual machine that we've created. If there are any questions, go ahead and type them in the live chat box to the right of the video, and I'll see them and I'll respond to them. Okay, everybody. So you should have saw a pop-up. Where is it? Here it is. Deployment succeeded a few seconds ago. And so everything is green here. So we are good to go, okay? And so what we want to do now is we're going to click on this SME v3. If you called yours something different, your virtual machine, then it will be that name here. We want to click on that, and that will take us to the dashboard for the SME v3 virtual machine. Okay, so if you are on a Mac, hopefully you went and got Microsoft Remote Desktop. Again, if you're on Windows, you should be good to go. Now what we want to do is we want to connect to it, okay? Microsoft provides a nifty little button up here that will, once you click it, allow you to download an RDP file, which is the file that will run on the RDP client to connect to your virtual machine, assuming everything is set up correctly. Hopefully ours is. So we will download that RDP file. By default, Microsoft names it the name of your virtual machine, which is perfect. Okay, and so I will drag this RDP file out to my desktop. Okay, now when you want to run it, you double click on it. It'll sit there and try to connect. Then it will ask you for your username and password. You specified the username and password, if you recall, on the first page of the wizard when you created the virtual machine. Okay, and so I'm going to type that information in here. It was Adam J. Cook. Password that should be whatever you selected it to be. Hopefully that's correct. It'll ask you to accept a certificate, which is fine. And off we go. And here we go. And so if you are using Windows 10 or similar as your desktop of choice, you will immediately know or recognize what's going on here. Okay, this is running inside of the RDP client. So you can see here, everything else is a Mac except for this window, which is projecting our virtual machine desktop onto our screen, and then we can use it like a normal Windows 10 machine. And of course, you know, given its resources of 4 virtual CPUs and 28 gigabytes of RAM, in some cases it's a lot more powerful than any computer you might have in your possession if you needed those kind of resources. I put some comments in the video description. Basically, why would you do this? Okay, well, the first reason you do it is I do it because I want to show people how to install software that they'll need for our workshops on a Windows box. And it's better if you use Windows because probably most of you out there were using Windows. The other reasons of doing this is because for some workloads, meaning for some websites, for some web applications, companies have developed their software using a Windows-based infrastructure. Let's say you're using an IIS, which is Microsoft's web server, or you're using Microsoft SQL Server, which is actually also available for Linux today, but perhaps you validated whatever your product was on Windows. And so you need a Windows box to run those workloads. And so this is how you would create it, essentially. Okay, so that's the reasons that these virtual machines, these Windows-based virtual machines exist. And of course, in Azure, you can also spin up Linux machines if you want and use those as well. It's a popular choice for a lot of companies. Anyway, so now we have a Windows desktop. Okay, we're just going to hit no here because we don't want to have it. Right away, Microsoft pops up their Edge web browser. Okay, and so we can minimize that. You can use it just like a normal web browser. You know, let's say I wanted, search for Python. Anaconda, which is a Python distribution that we use often. You can use it normally and download software. You can install software just as if it were a desktop. You can see this is a full-fledged version of Windows. Okay, and again, if you Windows 10, they have like a little search box down here. If you type in remote desktop, and you start typing it, you'll see that this remote desktop connection is in fact the client that is available to you to do RDP connections to Azure VMs. Okay, and that's already installed on a Windows 10 machine. Okay, and so if we want, we can take a look at the task manager for this virtual machine, and we'll expand it out and we'll look at the performance. Okay, so 28 gigabytes of memory. Okay, and then 4 virtual processors, which is precisely what we specified when we created the virtual machine. Okay, so again, that's how you go. I get a lot of questions on this about how I use a Windows 10 virtual machine on a macOS platform, and this is how you do it. Okay? So if there are any questions, I will look at the chat. I'll give it about a minute. Doesn't look like there's a lot of questions so far. And if not, remember, you can also hit me up on the SME virtual Reddit or the Discord chat. And I'm almost always on there if I'm at my desk, and you can ask me questions there. Okay, so I forgot a critical step. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to disconnect from this. So I hit the start button and then the power button here. We're just going to disconnect. We're just going to close the RDP session. It's not going to actually close or stop the virtual machine. Okay. Now, if you recall with the virtual machine, the problem or the potential problem is that the virtual machine is actually quite expensive if you keep it running. Okay, I don't need to keep it running because I just launched it for the purposes of this broadcast. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to delete it. Okay, so it stops running and you no longer incur the charges. Okay, if you are running production workloads on a virtual machine, then you would want to be careful with deleting it, obviously, because you don't want to delete your web application. Okay, but for this one, we're gonna hit the delete button. It's easy peasy. Okay, and we're just gonna hit yes on that. It's going to delete the virtual machine, which is something we want. So it's going to stop it and then deprovision it, and then we won't be charged anymore for it. And then there's one more step that you ought to do. And that is to click on All Resources tab over here. Okay, and so what you'll get is a listing of all the resources that you have created. Okay, some of this are not applicable to this webinar because I created these previously, but by default, when Azure creates resources for a particular virtual machine, it usually prefixes the resources with the virtual machine name. So they should really be in order when you look at this list. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to sort of clean those up, and we don't, so the list doesn't get populated with sort of orphan resources that aren't attached to a virtual machine. In some cases too, if you don't clean up these resources that were created as part of your virtual machine, you can be charged. For example, if you're using some premium storage, like premium SSD storage, some of those carry some costs if you keep it running. And so you have to be mindful of that. Okay, in this case, I don't believe any of these actually incur a cost, but we will delete them anyway just to clean it up, okay? And so what you can do is, so the virtual machine itself, which you can see here, is already being deleted. So we don't need to bother with that one, but we will check these, this network interface, and this is, I think, a network group, and then we have the IP that it provisioned for the IP address that it provisioned for our virtual machine, and then of course the disk itself. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're just going to check all those and hit delete, and it's going to ask us for some confirmation, and we're going to say yes, and then off it goes. And after a while, this little bell icon up here gives you some status. And of course, it holds the history for all the stuff that you've done in the past on the Azure dashboard. Okay, so if you want to see if something was successfully created or not, or there's some kind of warning, or there's some helpful tips sometimes, like some updates here, you go with the bell icon and you'll see those. Okay, now they're all gone. SME V2 was a virtual machine that I created previously, and I will be using that for the second of today's webinars, which is installing Qt on a virtual machine. So join us for that. And I don't see any questions, so I'll end today's webinar. Again, Reddit or the Discord chat, and I'll be on there to answer any questions. Thank you.